Okay. In conclusion, we've talked about how to select the right UI technology for an application. It's important to start with the user and what requirements they have. Native browser for the infrequent user, browser plugins for the occasional user, and desktop applications for the power users. Pick the lightest weight approach that meets your needs. You do not want to provide a solution that's too complicated or not powerful enough. Think about your use cases. It is often the case that on-the-road sales might want a simple interface that can run on a mobile system, where an inside sales needs a powerful desktop application. You do not have to pick a single UI technology for all users. Also, factor in the skills of the developers. If you have developers that are familiar with .NET, then take a serious look at Silverlight. If they're Java programmers, then take a look at Flex. And finally, follow the guidelines and principles of the OERA. There's a lot of great information on OERA in Progress communities. And finally, thank you, Mike and Frank, for joining me today.
Well, it was a pleasure being here.
Well, a pleasure for me as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
This is Peter Judge, and I'll be moderating Q&A for this session. I have Shelley Chase, Frank Hilhorst, and Mike Fechner with me. And we have a couple of questions that have already been submitted, so let's get started. So the first question I have here, and I think this is for Frank, Frank, would be, if I only have one code base, can I share it across different types of users? And if so, what's the best way to do this?
Yes, I think that the approach to reusing the investment that you already have in your application is through implementing a layering architecture. And I would say if you move, because you're a VAR, and a flashier UI gives you a competitive advantage, then you have to be aware that this may be as fickle as fashions, that maybe at some point in the future you may want to do this again. So in order to approach it, what I would do is to refactor your application using layering, using Model View Presenter or a design pattern, where basically you accomplish two things: that your code on the server side becomes 100% reusable, and you architect your application in such a way that the server side is big and the client side is small, so that little happens in the client on the client side. It does what it does best, which is its fancy UI features, and that'll allow you to migrate faster and allow you to migrate again fast if some other UI function gives you a competitive advantage.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question that's come in, which is, will Progress support WPF in the near future? I think this is probably best answered by Shelley, so I'm going to ask her to do that.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So WPF is Microsoft's desktop follow-on for WinForms, and WPF has not gotten that much traction. Microsoft has really focused more on Silverlight, and Silverlight can run in a browser or it can run out of a browser on the desktop. And Silverlight and WPF really tend to share a lot of the same controls, and but their runtimes are a little bit different. And so we're targeting Silverlight, which would give you both a browser and a desktop framework which to build on, rather than looking at WPF.
Great, thanks, Shelley. The next question we have, I think, is best suited for Mike. I have a character or an ADM1 or even an ADM2 application. How would you suggest I move forward to a more modern user interface?
Well, I think this question is much more easy to answer for the ADM1 or ADM2 interface, because since the release of OpenEdge 10.2a, Progress has enabled much more on the Progress GUI client, and ADM1 and ADM2 apps both run on the Progress GUI clients. And really over the last 2 years, we have successfully helped a lot of Progress application partners to improve Progress GUI applications, including 81, including 2, based on the GUI for .NET, and very often using a technology that I'll be talking about in my next presentation following this one, the embedded Windows. GUI is a bit more challenging because the GUI for .NET support is only part of the GUI client. So there we have two options. One is probably the hard way to separate the presentation code from the business logic and make it a properly laid application, giving you a lot of options for the UI. The other way would be to try to migrate Progress GUI to Progress GUI, and then actually use the capabilities of GUI for .NET. We are currently evaluating this step with 2 application partners, and so far it looks very promising that we can use the GUI for .NET also with GUI-style Progress for GL code.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Another one that's come in that's really interesting is, like, for Shelley, I guess. What are your plans for HTML5? I hear even IE9 is adding support for it.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, HTML5 is getting a lot of press, and certainly a lot of browsers are adding capabilities that are HTML5. And there's a lot of promise with HTML5, right? It will be able to do a lot of great things that right now you require plugins or libraries or stuff to do. The problem with it is there's no standards right now. So everybody's implementation of what HTML5 is unique, and that causes a real problem of how we could support it in a generic way. And so I think until the world of HTML5 matures and gets some standards set around it, it's really not a viable platform for business applications.
Okay. I think we have time for another one. You talked about following the OpenEdge reference architecture, but the presentation layer is in a single box in that diagram. Why does the architecture inside the presentation layer matter so much? I guess I'm not quite sure who this would be best suited to, so I think maybe, Frank, if you want to start with this, and we can see if Shelley and Mike have anything to add.
Yes, well obviously, the presentation layer is basically the way you achieve layering, and you basically achieve the reusability of what really is the investment of your application, which is your business logic. There are various ways of doing it, but the important thing is that you do it, and it is an investment. Like what we see here now is that my anticipation would be that if you are migrating to a different UI, this may not be the last time that you do it, but your investment in your business logic, that is really where the money is. That's really what you want to preserve.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd like to add to that when we first looked at the OpenEdge reference architecture, we certainly did it at a more at a broader level, and really have looked at best practices and white papers and our OpenEdge sample application to show the details within each of those big boxes. So we haven't really touched on the presentation layer too much before. I think along with GUI for .NET, we really started paying more attention to the presentation layer and how that architecture should be. And with RIA, we're certainly looking at that more extensively. And Peter, our moderator, happens to be working a lot in figuring out, what is our best practices for inside the presentation layer. And what he's found as he's gone along is that it's very important to architect it right, because as the next new presentation technology comes along, we don't want to really have to rewrite even the presentation layer. We want to reuse as much code as possible. So certainly the model can be reused if you're architecting your presentation layer right. So So that is really important, and you'll see that more and more in our documentation, white papers, and in OpenEdge.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Mike, anything to add on to that? You've got a minute or two.
Well, not a lot different than Shelley and Frank were saying. One thing that I've experienced working with the GUI for .NET is that besides aiming for being able to reuse as much of your front-end code on different potential UIs, in the same way it's important to build your UI in the way UI should be built in your current target architectures. It means that there may be similarities between developing Ajax, GUI for .NET, classical ADL GUI applications, but there are also very differences in how you should build them, to use the tools, to use the deployment effectively. So it's not just so generic, it also requires a lot of knowledge about the current target UI, which may certainly change in a couple of years or a couple of months.
Thanks, Mike.
If I may submit one more thing, that there is a session, future-proofing your application, that shows how you can, that shows the same UI in different UI technologies supported by the same code base. It shows it in Java, in 2 Ajax technologies, and in Progress, and it's all supported by exactly the same code base. So that would be an interesting session to attend. I forgot the number, but it's future-proofing your application.
Thanks, Frank. That's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank Mike and Frank and Shelley for all of your hard work in putting this session together and taking these great questions. To the audience, thank you very much for attending this session, and remember to keep your head in the cloud.